Al-Andalus, that is to say the period when parts of the Iberian Peninsula was under Islamicate rule, from 711 to 1492, was not one thing, and I will tell you why its history is complicated and cannot be summarized in simple platitudes or terms. Firstly, Al-Andalus was not under one Islamicate rulership, but several, as there were many dynasties and periods of Islamicate rule over the Iberian Peninsula. First, you have the Greater Umayyad Caliphate from 711 to 750. Then you have the Umayyad Emirate and later Caliphate of Cordoba from 750 to 929 to 1031. Basically, 711 to 1031 was under the Umayyad dynasty, but with a lot of differences between these periods. Then you have the first Taifa period from 1009 to 1110, when Al-Andalus was split between a lot of smaller entities. Taifa coming from the Arabic word Taifa, meaning group or faction. Then you have the Almoravid Empire of 1085 to 1145. Then you have the second Taifa period from 1140 to 1203, which was a second period of a lot of smaller entities fighting against each other. Then you have the Almohad Caliphate from 1147 to 1238, followed again by a third Taifa period from 1232 to 1287, which again was a period of smaller entities fighting each other. And then ultimately you had the Nasrid Emirate of Granada that lasted from 1238 to 1492. All distinct periods, and with a lot of variation within these periods and political situations that arose due to the various historical circumstances during these times. And you have to keep this in mind when discussing the history of Al-Andalus, or when studying the history of Al-Andalus. For example, one thing that is often discussed when discussing Al-Andalus is the supposed tolerance that existed there. And yes, it is true, there were periods of pretty far-reaching tolerance, at least in comparison to most European medieval history. And the Jews in Al-Andalus had what could be called a golden period within the history of Al-Andalus, where they prospered in Al-Andalus in a way that they could not elsewhere in Europe, due to the persecutions and discrimination that occurred there. But the tolerance of Al-Andalus needs to be considered in its context of being during the medieval period. It was not modern tolerance, but tolerance by the standards of the medieval period, when persecution and discrimination was the norm. Also, it needs to be considered that this tolerance came with a lot of caveats and exceptions, and was not always applied during certain periods of time either. Being a non-Muslim in Al-Andalus meant that you were a dhimmi, a non-Muslim subject to Muslim dominion and Islamic rules regarding non-Muslims. And in order to be allowed to keep your old religion, you had to abide by various restrictions and by various rules and impositions, such as the jizya tax, a tax that was often far higher than the tax that the Muslims had to pay, and sometimes even to the level that the people that were subject to this tax starved, such as during the Cordoban martyr period in the 850s, and the following mass persecutions of the Christians that followed. Often though, especially during the age of most of the Umayyad period, the jizya tax was equal to about 1 dinar per adult per year, which was lower than in Egypt around the same period, though it was not per household head like in Egypt. As in Al-Andalus, it tended to be an individualized tax, paid by individuals rather than paid by families. In any case, the annual tax rates were usually about a fourth to a third higher for non-Muslims than for Muslims. So you were allowed to keep your religion, which was pretty tolerant, but in exchange you had to pay a significantly higher tax rate, or even exorbitant tax rates, if the ruler decided to raise the tax rate for whatever reason that the ruler decided was an appropriate reason to raise the taxes. So as a non-Muslim, you were at the mercy of the ruler's judgment and decisions regarding your existence as a non-Muslim, which you could see at, for example, the period of the 850s and 860s, where the rates of the jizya tax were raised to exorbitant levels that made it impossible for people to pay them and thus get punished for not paying them, or forced into exile, or more likely forced to convert to Islam. Furthermore, throughout al-Andalus history, you have many examples of smaller and larger, more direct types of persecutions towards non-Muslims. For example, pogroms against Jews in Al-Andalus that occurred in Cordoba the year 1011 and in Granada 1066. And then you have the Almoravid Empire and the Almohad Caliphate that did forced direct conversions and were known to have conducted several massacres and acts of persecution against both Christians and Jews. Some of which, such as the family of the Jewish theologian and scholar Maimonides, fled east to more tolerant Muslim lands in order to avoid these persecutions. They fled east towards other more tolerant Muslim lands because, as again, you need to see these issues of intolerance in Al-Andalus in a greater context. Christian Europe was generally not better, though of course there existed also exceptions there, historically in certain periods and places. Furthermore, on the subject of persecutions, you also had the fact that generally throughout the history of Al-Andalus, if you converted away from Islam, you were executed, which is still the case in certain countries that claim to be Islamic today, or base their laws upon what they claim to interpret as Islam. Some historically significant examples of this are some of the Cordoban martyrs, who were accused of having converted to Islam and then left the religion, and thus were executed. And on the subject of intolerance and injustice, every intolerance and injustice was not connected to religion either in the history of Al-Andalus, as you had what could most charitably be described as an ethnic class society as well, that went against what could be considered certain ideals about the equality between various believers and practices in certain interpretations of Islam. During the early Umayyad period, though not later as many of the later dynasties in Al-Andalus were made up or were propped up by Berbers and native converts, you had what could almost be described as a caste system, with Arabs at the top and Muwaladun, native-born converts to Islam, and Berbers being beneath them. A sort of racial hierarchical system that most interpretations of Islam would reject. Though speaking about hierarchies, and something that actually exists in traditional fiqh, in traditional Islamic jurisprudence, and which is going to be a very, very controversial subject right now. But please, my listeners, don't take offense to what I'm saying now, because what I'm trying to say here is simply my interpretation of various sources and of the facts of the matter, trying to get closer to how it was in the past. It is not me condoning this matter or demonizing the ones that practiced it in the past, as I tend to want to stay away from moralizing matters in the past. And the matter being slavery. In Al-Andalus, like in the rest of the Islamicate world, slavery was practiced. And these could be slaves of various types. There were mining and farming slaves, to household slaves, and even slave soldiers, some of which actually were treated far better than many free men. Though again, these were the minority of slaves. The majority of slaves were plantation and mining slaves, which were treated like most slaves have been treated throughout human history in those fields. In fact, the use of slaves on the plantations and in the silver mines in southern Spain during the period of Al-Andalus can easily be compared to the use of slavery by the Romans and the Carthaginians before them for the same purposes of providing manpower for the labor-intensive agriculture and for extracting the silver in the silver mines, both of which were very labor intensive and dangerous types of work to do, hence the use of slavery. So, regarding slavery, the period of Al-Andalus, the period of Islamicate rule, does not really differ from previous periods of other entities controlling the Iberian Peninsula. Al-Andalus throughout its history had a complex interplay between classes and groups of people due to economical considerations, due to the existence of various types of slaves and non-slaves, due to various considerations of ethnic backgrounds and religion, with various Sunni subsects such as the Maliki and Dahiri Sunni Muslims tending to dominate in various periods, and non-Muslims with various categories of groups with various special considerations as well. Sometimes Christians had more privileges, sometimes Jews had more privileges, for example. And these things often intersected with other categories as well, and various special circumstantial considerations as well. Often this is simplified in Muslim Arabs at the top, then Muslim Berbers, and then Muwaladun, that is to say native-born converts to Islam, and then non-Muslim dhimmis, and then beneath them non-free slaves. But it is a lot more complex than this in reality, which is kind of the point of this video, to show the complexities inherent in the history of Al-Andalus. Now over to another point that is often discussed regarding Al-Andalus, and that is that Al-Andalus was a very peaceful period of Iberian history. And this is also true to a certain extent, at least from 718 to 1000 after the conquest of the Iberian Peninsula. It could be considered a mostly peaceful period, especially in comparison to some places in Europe during this time, and certain places in the Middle East that were a lot more volatile and in chaos during this same period. But still, we have to remember here that we are speaking about 3 centuries of life and human experience here. So there were exceptions. For example, you did have rebellions made by the Muwaladun, the native-born converts to Islam, that made rebellions against the Umayyads, as they considered the Umayyads to be oppressive overlords due to their preferential treatment of Arabs over non-Arabs as a standard of policy. And in the 9th to the 10th centuries, several rebellions occurred, led by leaders such as Omar ibn Hafsun, who led a decades-long rebellion against the Umayyads, with many conflicts back and forth. Thus, even in this period, there are exceptions to the peacefulness of this period of Andalusian history. Furthermore, this was about the internal peace of Al-Andalus. On the outside of Al-Andalus, during this period, there were several raids made into the north of Europe, with enslavement and other brutality being committed during these raids. And in this regard, the various entities in Al-Andalus, such as the Umayyads, did not differ from other political entities during this period in Europe, in that they did do raids and waged wars against other entities on the European continent. Also, notice when I talked about the peaceful period of Andalusian history, that I did specifically skip over the initial conquest of the Iberian Peninsula and its direct consequences, such as the later incursions into what is modern-day France. Because it should be noted that these initial invasions were brutal and bloody, as told in sources such as the Byzantine Chronicle of 741 and the Musarab Chronicle of 754, and in the Arabic sources that recount these events, such as in the writings of Ibn Abd al-Hakam, which all describe acts such as mass killings, plundering, and enslavement of people, which are acts that would most definitely not be described as peaceful by most people. And descriptions of Al-Andalus being peaceful need to be considered as simplifications rather than 100% reflective of all Andalusian history. As once again, Andalusian history is a lot more complex than just one mere description. And the various conflicts and wars that involved Al-Andalus should be considered from various perspectives and not only from one perspective, because Christians made war upon the political entities found in Al-Andalus throughout its history too. And following the capture of Toledo in 1085 by Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, many of the Islamicate entities within Al-Andalus would constantly be the subjects of various attacks and be under threat from various Christian entities in the north. Though, of course, you had periods like the Almoravids and the Almohads where power went back in the favor of various Islamicate entities in Al-Andalus temporarily. So you did have periods of back and forth conflicts and skirmishes between Christian and Islamic polities on the Iberian Peninsula, often creating very complex religious political situations. And on the subject of religion, and on the subject of Christianity and Islam being used as state religions, with descriptions such as Islamic or Christian, and various complex exceptions and political situations associated with this. Islam was the state religion in all of the polities within Al-Andalus, by definition. But these polities, in many cases, did many things that were not connected to Islam, or even went against the teachings of Islam, depending upon interpretation and definition of Islam. Catamites, or boy slaves, were kept in the harems of several famous and infamous leaders during the period of Al-Andalus, such as Al-Hakam II of the Umayyad dynasty. And we do have a lot of homoerotic poetry coming from the area of Al-Andalus as well, with Ibn Qusman al-Zuhri's poetry probably being the most famous among many other poets that wrote about same-sex male lovers. Though, to be fair, we do have similar poetry from the Eastern Arabic world too. Poetry that is even more explicit and extreme in its focus on sexuality, to the degree that even for a Western modern audience it might seem extreme. Abu Nuwas, I'm looking at you! In any case, Islamic norms did not condone this, but these elements of a rather libertine view on sexuality and the acceptance of these elements still existed within Andalusian culture and the greater culture of the Arab world during the medieval period, during this time, in parallel with and sometimes against what was considered the Islamic norms in these matters. And these matters demonstrate the complexity with regards to questions about tolerance and Islamic norms that existed in Andalusian history and also elsewhere in the Arabic world, as this is greater than just Al-Andalus. Also, regarding religion and politics in Andalusian history, often political expediency and clan considerations, family politics, were considered more important than religion historically in Al-Andalusian history. For example, neither the Muslim political entities or the Christian entities that were involved in Andalusian history were especially united, as they constantly fought each other instead of their opposite religious enemies, due to reasons of political expediency and local political gain. And sometimes even joined the political entities on either side of the religious divide in order to get political gain or revenge on someone. I mentioned the rebel leader of Omar ibn Hafsun before, who rebelled against the Umayyads and fought against them. Well, he did a lot of other things too, where he, among other things, temporarily converted to Christianity, seeking Christian help from the north, and called for allegiance with Shia Islam in order to seek aid from the Ismaili Shia Fatimids across the Mediterranean Sea, and to just finally also rejoin the Umayyads against the northern Christian kingdom of Castile. In other words, he shifted his political religious allegiance a lot during his career as a leader. And later, you have, for example, the famous commander El Cid in the 11th century, who fought for both Muslim and Christian overlords, depending upon the political situation. And these two were far from the only ones that did this. Politics on the Iberian Peninsula during the Andalusian period were very complex, with a lot of events, intrigues, and political situations that reached across the religious divide. So it was not simply Muslims versus Christians most of the time, but rather very complex clan conflicts and conflicts between various entities that often worked with or against each other, depending upon the local political situation. Hence, simplifications such as Andalusian history being about Muslims versus Christians is a simplification that has a lot of exceptions, making this into a very complex matter to discuss, just like Andalusian history generally is very complicated. And on the subject of complicated, and thus requiring advanced understanding, Al-Andalus is seen as being this center of advanced knowledge in the medieval period. This period and place where great advancements in the knowledge of humankind were achieved. Was Al-Andalus advanced? And to this I have to answer, yes, surprisingly so, but with a lot of nuance and intricate factors to consider when discussing this matter. From the earliest days, the Umayyads wanted to be seen as just as great patrons of knowledge as their rivals, the Abbasids, in the east. So, in Cordoba, many libraries and educational institutions were financed and built to rival that of the Abbasid capital Baghdad in Iraq. And this tradition of patronage to the advancement of knowledge continued under many later dynasties and political entities within Andalusian history. Consequently, you have many advancements and persons that advanced Islamicate and Western science that came from Al-Andalus, including major advances in trigonometry made by people such as Jabir ibn Aflah, astronomy by Az-Zarqali and Ibn Tufail and Ibn Rushd, in surgery by As-Sahrawi, pharmacology by Ibn Zuhr, and agronomy by Ibn Basal and Abu al-Khair al-Ishbili. Al-Andalus became a conduit for cultural and scientific exchange between the Islamicate and Christian worlds. The Western Arabic Indian numeral system was developed in Al-Andalus and then exported out to the rest of Europe. And it wasn't the only thing that was taken from Al-Andalus and then integrated into Western knowledge and thinking later. Though there is a question how far you can take this and argue for knowledge from Al-Andalus having been taken and integrated into the Western world historically. And if you can even go so far as to claim, as some people do, that the knowledge production in Al-Andalus was vital for the later Renaissance in Europe. It is clear that many examples of knowledge that we see in later European history seem to have their origin in discoveries made in Al-Andalus. And we also know of examples where they were directly taken from the knowledge production in Al-Andalus. But we have also examples of what was first assumed to be knowledge taken from Al-Andalus, but later turned out to be separate reinventions made in the Western world, and or taken from the Byzantine Empire or some other source rather than from Al-Andalus. And sometimes what was borrowed from Al-Andalus was heavily changed as well. For example, Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes, is significantly altered in his Western interpretations regarding philosophy, if you compare them with the original Arabic positions regarding the role of faith and logic in life, which is actually a subject I might discuss in a future video. But suffice to say, generally the knowledge production of Al-Andalus was vast, but its relationship to the European traditions of knowledge creation are complex, and I would probably not use terms as saying that Al-Andalus was the mother of the later European Renaissance, but I would say that it definitely was a contributor to the European traditions of knowledge creation that came later during the Renaissance. But on the subject of knowledge creation and curating knowledge, it is important to know that not all periods or rulers were the same when it comes to Al-Andalus and its contribution to the knowledge of humanity. You had, for example, the Umayyad Caliph Hisham II, that when he took over and gave the real power to his Hajib, Al-Mansur ibn Abi Amir, various book burnings were ordered to burn works regarding philosophy and or anything else that could be considered threatening to what Ibn Abi Amir considered the right path of Islam. Similarly, during the Almoravid and Almohad periods, you also had various times when book burnings occurred, and various thinkers and men of knowledge were killed due to being perceived as being against the current dogma of Islamic thinking that was promoted by the rulers and the powers that had the control back then. It should also be pointed out that the advanced nature of Andalusian society wasn't only seen in its knowledge production in ideas, but also in its architecture. As you can see, advanced architecture such as the Alhambra palace and the Cordoban mosque, but also in large-scale irrigation projects that still remain to this very day on the Iberian Peninsula as working structures still in use. And Andalusian society mixed a lot of architecture styles when they made their various buildings, as you had native styles combined with Arabic Berber styles, combined also with Byzantine styles of architecture. In fact, the early Umayyads actually borrowed Byzantine architects to build some of the buildings in Al-Andalus, including the Cordoban Mosque, now the Cathedral of Cordoba. The surviving architecture of Al-Andalus represents a complex mixture of Eastern and Western architectural styles, a history of architecture that goes far beyond just Arabic history and includes elements and influences also upon the Western world. And speaking about being bigger than just Arabic history, Andalusian history is actually far greater than just Arabic history, as it wasn't just Arabs that were involved in it. As in addition to Arabs, you had the Berbers, who always were a large part of Andalusian history. And you still had Christians in the north outside of Arabic Muslim control, as the entire Iberian Peninsula was not conquered, and people speaking local Latin dialects also existed inside Al-Andalus. And you had Arabic-influenced Romance languages as well within Al-Andalus. Thus, consequently, in order to get a good view of the history of Al-Andalus, you have many sources in many different languages, and not only in Arabic. You have sources in Latin, in Castilian, Spanish, and Portuguese, and several other languages too. And this also makes it very hard to get a good overview of Andalusian history when you look at it as an historian that might only know one or two of the languages in which the sources are written. And this creates further complications when it comes to writing unbiased history regarding Andalusian history, as you get different views from where you look. From one side, you will get the evil Islamic conquerors that oppress Christians, and from the other side, you will get the righteous Islamic jihad that spreads the true faith of Islam, depending upon source and which languages you are able to speak. As just another example, or you can get views that are somewhat in the middle, depending upon the sources that are available for you. Me, myself, I have to rely upon mainly the Arabic and Latin sources, and sometimes translations of other sources, as I do not know Castilian Spanish or any of the other languages which were used on the Iberian Peninsula during this period of Andalusian history. Speaking about various views about things depending upon sources, One further complicating part regarding Andalusian history is how you view it in a meta sense regarding issues such as colonialism and power relationships. Was it colonialism or not when the Iberian Peninsula was conquered in the 8th century AD? Some would say yes, because it was a conquest by a foreigner that imposed their culture and their religion upon the natives through various methods of suppression and repression, and took control of the various native resources, such as the silver mines and the plantation fields. Some would argue no, pointing towards the fact that it was a very different time period with very different rules and very different circumstances in how you acted generally, politically at this time in human history. And some people, like myself included, would just say that we should not moralize these matters, but rather just describe them and analyze them as they happened, and why they happened, and how they were justified by the people at that time, rather than imposing our morals upon the past. Connected to these discussions regarding colonialism or not, you have discussions among historians about how much of a demographic influence the initial conquest of the Iberian Peninsula had. Here you have on the most extreme example, the Guicard hypothesis. Though its most extreme forms have been dismissed by DNA evidence and other evidence, it is the hypothesis that there was a great replacement of native peoples when the Arabic Islamic invasions happened. DNA evidence have disproved great replacements of large amounts of people, though it should be said that certain areas and regions have been shown to have been majorly affected by the initial invasions, with at least localized examples of replacements. Though these aren't large on a larger scale, but locally affected areas here and there. Furthermore, a people isn't only its genes or DNA, it's also cultural legacies and religious traditions, many of which were suppressed during the Arabic Islamic invasions and afterwards, through various cultural and religious policies that promoted Islam and Arabic culture at the expense of local religious traditions and their culture. From the Umayyad Caliphate and to later Islamicate political entities within Andalusian history. To me, I see this as just a normal part of history, as I don't judge this to be very different from when the Romans conquered the Iberian Peninsula long before, and through Romanization changed the local culture away from the previous Carthaginians and Gallic groups that had lived there on the Iberian Peninsula. Though it is not only the initial conquest by the Arabic Islamic armies that is discussed from a historical meta-value judgment perspective, but also the Reconquista by the Christian northern Iberians. And here you get discussions about the fact of the matter if it should be considered a reconquest of lands that had been taken, or if it should simply be viewed as a conquest. After all, when Granada fell, the last Muslim stronghold on the Iberian Peninsula had fallen, bringing the end of Al-Andalus. Then Al-Andalus had lasted for more than 700 years, from 711 to 1492 with the fall of Granada. That time is longer than the time from the fall of Granada in 1492 to our days. With these long time spans of Al-Andalus having existed in one form or the other, can it really be said to have been a reconquest rather than just a conquest of the land? And then you also have considerations about what happened during the Reconquista from the first initial invasions by the northern Iberian Christians to the last fall of Granada, and all of the suffering that this reconquest also brought. Because when, for example, Granada fell, what followed was forced mass conversions and a mass exodus of people from what had been Al-Andalus to northern Africa. But that was for the Muslims. For the Christians during this time, they saw fighting Al-Andalus and fighting the various political entities that were part of Andalusian history as a fight against a religious enemy. And for the Christians, taking Granada saw the ending of the threat from the south, as Granada had in the past done raids and requested aid from other Muslim dynasties, such as the Marinids, to wage war against the various Christians of the rest of the Iberian Peninsula. But at the same time, the fall of Granada and the ultimate fall of Al-Andalus was a great tragedy for the people that now suffered due to their Muslim faith in front of the merciless reconquest by the Iberian Christians, where many would fall victim to the vicissitudes of history, where 100,000 had died or been enslaved, 200,000 emigrated, and 200,000 remained as the residual population. Many of the Muslim elite, including Muhammad XII, the last ruler of the Emirate of Granada, who had even been given a small principality in the Alpujarras mountains as a peace compromise, decided that living under Christian overlordship was intolerable and thus emigrated to North Africa. Personally, I try to avoid moralizing old history, but there is no denying that the history of Al-Andalus is filled with very complex moral questions if you want to go into moralizing history, as it is such a multifaceted history with so many considerations that you have to take into account. And this is just one further reason as to why Andalus and its history is such a very complex matter to discuss. And in this video, which is over half an hour, I have only scratched the surface of this enormously complex history. But you, my viewers, what are your views on this history after this video? And do you have any comments or questions that you would like to pose? Then please post them in the comment section, as I love interacting with you, my viewers. Please do subscribe, as it would help the channel spread awareness about the humanities.
اشتركوا بالقناة في مثلكم.